If Mark Laita tried to return as the Whittakers caregiver in 2026, who actually gets to decide? Yes or no? Because this question is already being answered wrong in most comment sections. People imagine a single moment, a familiar face pulling into the driveway, groceries in the trunk, maybe repairs around the house, maybe no cameras this time, maybe just help. But that picture skips the only thing that matters in 2026. Permission, not emotional permission, not audience approval, not nostalgia, legal permission. And that's where the story actually starts. Because the word caregiver does not mean one thing anymore. In 2026, it splits into 3 completely different lanes. Confusing those lanes is how vulnerable families get hurt, even when intentions are good. So before anyone argues about whether Mark should return, we have to answer a more basic question. What would return legally mean now? What return really means? When people say Mark could come back, they're usually picturing Lane 1 without realizing it. Lane 1 is informal help. This is neighbor-style assistance, dropping off food, fixing a broken door, helping carry supplies, bringing heaters in winter. It can be kind. It can also quietly turn into dependence if there are no boundaries. Informal help is where most well-meaning situations begin and where many dangerous ones hide. Lane 2 is organized support. This is help with structure, clear limits, clear permission, documentation, a plan that does not rely on one person's judgment and does not collapse when public attention spikes. Organized support assumes vulnerability and builds guardrails around it. Lane 3 is legal authority. This is where caregiver stops being a feeling and becomes power. Who decides where someone lives? Who controls access? Who speaks on their behalf? Who manages money? Who signs documents? Who gives consent? This is not symbolic power. It is enforceable power. And here's the heartbreak most people miss. The internet treats presence like authority. If someone is physically there, the audience assumes they're in charge. If someone is filming, people assume they're the protector. But vulnerable adults are not protected by vibes. They are protected by consent, oversight, and law. And in 2026, that distinction is no longer optional. Why timing changed everything. Mark publicly stated in 2024 that he stepped back from filming and ended the GoFundMe. At the time, that was framed as a personal decision. In 2026, that same step back does something much bigger. It reshapes how the system sees involvement. Because when someone steps away from fundraising, filming, and daily presence, agencies recalibrate. They redraw the map of who has access, who has influence, and who carries responsibility. So the real question isn't would Mark return. It's this. Who has the power to say yes or no now? Because in 2026, the first barrier is not emotion. It's permission. The gatekeepers appear immediately. If anyone tries to return as a caregiver, Mark or anyone else, the gatekeepers appear instantly. Not as villains, as barriers designed to prevent exactly the kind of chaos fame creates. Gatekeeper number 1 is the household itself. Whoever controls the property and daily environment has the right to set conditions. No visits, limited visits, visits only with someone present. No filming, no posting, no private access, no money handling. Those rules apply regardless of how well-known the helper is. Familiarity does not override property rights. Gatekeeper number 2 is protective services. By late 2025 into 2026, reports indicate that parts of the Whittaker family are no longer simply living off the grid. Protective services involvement changes everything. Once the state steps in, privacy tightens. Locations become confidential. Access becomes controlled. And the reason is simple. When someone is legally recognized as vulnerable, unrestricted contact becomes a risk. The system does not assume malice. It assumes exposure, and exposure is treated like danger. Gatekeeper number 3 is law enforcement, but only when specific triggers appear. Not drama, not comments, hook, not speculation. Real triggers: harassment, trespass, threats, fraud, attempts to bypass protective custody. And this is where the context hardens. Why 2026 is not 2019. In January 2026, West Virginia State Police arrested John Patrick Rourke on multiple felony charges tied to alleged financial exploitation and fraudulent schemes connected to donations involving the Whittaker family. That single fact changes the environment permanently, because once law enforcement brings exploitation charges into the public record, every agency involved becomes more cautious. Neighbors become cautious. Service providers become cautious. Caseworkers become cautious. Anyone with access becomes cautious. Not because everyone is suspected, but because the system has learned how fast attention turns into leverage. So even if every individual involved personally wanted Mark to return, one question can still stop it cold. What does the system now allow when vulnerability and money have already collided? And this is where the internet keeps getting it wrong. Presence is not authority. People assume that if someone shows up, they're allowed to be there. That's backwards. In 2026, showing up without authorization is the fastest way to trigger restriction, not access. The system no longer asks, do they mean well? It asks, who approved this, and who is accountable if something goes wrong? Because once the idea of a return moves from emotion to reality, the system doesn't wait. It responds. And it responds the same way every time a vulnerable family becomes high profile, by installing gatekeepers. Not to punish, not to accuse, but to slow everything down. Because speed is how harm happens. So if someone tries to re-enter the Whittakers' lives as a caregiver in 2026, the question is not who wants it. The question is who is legally allowed to permit it. And that answer is layered. Gatekeeper 1, the household and property control. The first gatekeeper is the simplest and the one people most often ignore. Who controls the space? Whoever owns, leases, or is legally responsible for the property has immediate authority to say, no visits, limited visits, visits only with supervision, no filming, no posting, no private access. That authority exists regardless of history, familiarity, or public sympathy. And here's the important part. Once a household becomes associated with vulnerability and prior exploitation allegations, informal access stops being neutral. A familiar face doesn't override risk assessment. If the household says no, the system backs that no, not because it assumes danger, but because it assumes responsibility lies there first. Gatekeeper 2, protective services. This is where the landscape truly changes. By late 2025 into 2026, parts of the Whittaker family are no longer treated as simply isolated or unconventional. Protective services involvement signals a shift from privacy to protection. Once protective services step in, access is no longer social. It becomes conditional. Caseworkers do not ask, do you trust this person? They ask, what role would this person play, and under what authority? Protective services focus on 3 things. Risk exposure. Does contact increase the chance of exploitation, manipulation, or dependency? Control pathways. Could this person become a gatekeeper themselves? Precedent. If we allow this, what else are we implicitly allowing? That third one matters more than people realize. Allowing one unsupervised return creates a model others will try to follow. And when fame is involved, copycats appear fast. That's why protective services often respond by narrowing access rather than expanding it, even when intentions appear good. not because they distrust helpers, because they distrust systems without structure. Gatekeeper 3. The legal climate after exploitation allegations. This is the gatekeeper nobody likes to talk about because it removes discretion. Once law enforcement publicly files charges tied to alleged exploitation, the environment hardens. Agencies shift from collaborative to defensive. Why? Because if anything goes wrong later, the question becomes, who allowed this? Who approved access after exploitation was already documented? Who failed to restrict contact? In 2026, no agency wants to be the answer to those questions. So the default posture becomes caution. That means fewer people allowed in, more documentation, more supervision, less tolerance for ambiguity. This applies even to people who previously helped. History does not override liability. Why the internet's logic breaks here. Online, people think access is relational. He knows them. They trust him. He helped before. The system does not operate that way. The system treats access as procedural. Who authorized it? Who monitors it? Who documents it? Who is accountable? Without those answers, access is a liability. And liability is the one thing institutions are designed to avoid. The myth of just checking in. This is where many well-intentioned people get blindsided. They believe a return can be casual. I'll just stop by. I'll just help with repairs. I won't stay long. In a normal household, maybe. In a legally protected environment, no. Casual presence becomes undocumented presence. Undocumented presence becomes risk, especially when the household is already known to be vulnerable and visible. Even checking in can trigger scrutiny if it bypasses established channels. Why familiarity can increase risk. This sounds counterintuitive, but it's central to how the system thinks. Familiar helpers are often given more trust informally, more access, more discretion. That's exactly why systems tighten around them. Because exploitation rarely begins with strangers. It begins with people who are already trusted. This is not an accusation. It's a pattern. And systems are built around patterns, not personal feelings. The silent gatekeeper, liability. There's one more gatekeeper people don't see. Insurance, funding agencies, nonprofit partners. Once a family becomes associated with vulnerability and exploitation risk, any outside involvement triggers questions about liability. If someone returns and something goes wrong, financially, medically, emotionally, the fallout doesn't stop with that person. It spreads outward, to agencies, to partners, to anyone who allowed access. That's why permission becomes harder to obtain, not easier. The key shift in 2026. Here is the pivot most people miss. In earlier years, the question might have been, is this person helpful? In 2026, the question is this arrangement safe even if everything goes wrong? That's a much higher bar, and it has nothing to do with trust in one individual. It has everything to do with protecting people who cannot fully protect themselves. What this means for any return. So if someone, Mark or anyone else, wanted to return and they ask, do the Whittakers want help? Or would they agree to Mark coming back? In 2026, those questions are incomplete. The real question is this: who is legally capable of giving consent? And what kind of consent actually counts? Because once incapacity enters the official record, consent stops being a feeling and becomes a threshold. And thresholds change everything. Why consent is the center of the system. Consent is the backbone of caregiving law. It determines who can authorize care, who can accept help, who can refuse it, who is responsible if something goes wrong. When adults are fully capable, consent can be informal. A nod, a yes, a conversation. When adults are considered vulnerable or incapacitated, consent becomes formal. And in 2026, that distinction matters more than anything else. Reports tied to the ongoing legal and protective landscape emphasize that multiple members of the Whittaker family are nonverbal and have disabilities that complicate legal consent. Once that is acknowledged by the system, everything tightens. Not out of cruelty, out of obligation. Incapacity is not an insult. It's a legal status. This is where language matters. Incapacitated does not mean incapable of feeling, wanting, or expressing preference. It means the law does not treat every expression as legally sufficient consent. The system asks, can this person understand the nature of what is being agreed to? Can they understand the consequences? Can they revoke consent meaningfully? Can they protect themselves if the arrangement becomes harmful? If the answer to those questions is unclear, consent must come from elsewhere. That's not dehumanization. That's protection. Why they seem okay with it is not enough. This is one of the most dangerous myths online. People say, they seemed happy. They didn't object. They've known him for years. None of that substitutes for legal consent when vulnerability is established. Silence is not consent. Familiarity is not consent. Gratitude is not consent. And this matters because informal consent is how power quietly shifts. A helper starts making decisions. A helper becomes the translator. A helper becomes the filter between the family and the world. And suddenly, authority exists without accountability. The system exists to stop that from happening, even when the helper believes they're doing good. The court watch world nobody talks about. If a return crossed from informal help into caregiving authority, it would enter what professionals call a court watch environment. This does not mean constant hearings or punishment. It means scrutiny. In West Virginia, when adults are legally protected, guardianship or similar structures impose fiduciary duty. That a legal obligation to act solely in the protected person's best interest. Fiduciary duty comes with requirements: reporting, documentation, boundaries, prohibition against self-benefit. This is not optional, and it's the line most people don't see. Someone might believe they're just helping, while the system sees decision-making power being exercised without authorization. That gap is where investigations start. Why caregiver is not a casual title. The word caregiver sounds gentle, but legally it's heavy. Caregivers can influence daily routines, medical access, financial flows, social contact, living conditions. Once someone is labeled vulnerable, anyone influencing those areas becomes visible to the system, even without intent, even without payment, even without a title, which means that returning just to help can accidentally create legal exposure for the helper and for the family. The shadow of exploitation changes everything. By 2026, the Whittaker family is no longer a hypothetical case. They are a documented one. The arrest of John Patrick Rourke on multiple felony charges tied to alleged financial exploitation fundamentally alters how consent is evaluated around this family. Once exploitation is alleged, agencies stop giving benefit of the doubt. They start asking, who has access? Who benefits? Who controls information? Who handles money? And most importantly, who could influence consent? This is why even helpers with no criminal intent face higher scrutiny now. Not because the system assumes guilt, because it assumes risk. Why money is the brightest red line. In 2026, money and consent are inseparable. Any handling of funds, even small amounts, intersects with fiduciary law when vulnerable adults are involved. No big deal. Money becomes a big deal instantly. Buying supplies, paying bills, holding cash, managing donations. All of it becomes evidence if something goes wrong. This is why agencies draw such a hard line. Not because money is evil, because money turns informal care into authority faster than anything else. And authority without consent is exploitation, even when no one intended it. The internet's favorite argument, and why it fails. People say, but Mark helped before. But he knows them. But they trust him. That argument collapses under one question. Who would be legally responsible if harm occurred after the return? Because trust does not assign liability. Authorization does. And in 2026, authorization must be clear, documented, and revocable. Otherwise, the answer becomes everyone. And the system avoids that outcome at all costs. Why this isn't about punishing helpers. This part matters. The safeguards people see as obstacles are not meant to block them. Where this leaves the return question. So when people ask, should Mark come back? The responsible answer is, only if consent is legally valid, authorization is clear, oversight exists, and power is distributed, not concentrated. Anything less is not a return. It's a risk. And that's the truth part 3 forces us to confront. Good intentions do not fail the consent test. Ambiguity does. At this point, the conversation has to stop pretending there's only one outcome. Because in 2026, the exact same action, someone returning to help the Whittakers, can lead to 2 completely different futures. Not because intentions change, not because people suddenly become good or bad, but because structure changes everything. So let's run both timelines side by side, slowly, cleanly, without drama. This is the part most people skip, and it's why the debate online keeps looping instead of resolving. Timeline 1. The best case outcome, why it looks boring. Best case does not look like a savior returning. It looks like paperwork. It looks like boundaries. It looks like accountability that survives attention. If Mark Laita or anyone else were to return under best case conditions in 2026, here's what that actually looks like. Step 1. Permission is explicit and centralized. There is one verified point of authorization. Not 5 people saying yes. Not a general sense of agreement. Not, they seemed okay with it. One legally recognized authority, a guardian, caseworker, or court-recognized representative, is empowered to approve or deny access. If that authority says, limited visits only, supervised presence, no caregiving authority, that's the rule. No negotiation through social pressure. No end runs via familiarity. This immediately removes confusion about who decides what. Step 2. Scope is narrow and defined. Best case, help is limited in scope. Not, I'll take care of things. I'll handle it. They trust me. But repairs only. Deliveries only. Scheduled assistance only. No one person becomes responsible for everything. Why that matters? Because when scope is undefined, power expands quietly. Defined scope prevents accidental control. Step 3. No money, no gray zones. In best case, the helper does not touch money. No cash. No envelopes. No, I'll pay it back later. No donation handling. Every dollar flows through verified, documented channels. Receipts exist. Accounting exists. Visibility exists. Not because the helper is suspected, but because money is where good intentions collapse under pressure, especially in a family that has already been tied to alleged exploitation. Step 4. Oversight is normalized, not resented. In the best case, oversight is expected. Check-ins, logs, documentation, clear reporting lines. This is not framed as distrust. It's framed as protection for the family and the helper. Because oversight protects against misunderstandings, accusations, narrative drift. And in a famous case, narrative drift is lethal. Step 5. no exclusive access. In the best case, no one person becomes the gate. There are multiple points of contact, multiple witnesses, multiple layers. If one helper leaves, the system does not collapse. That's the acid test. Care that collapses when one person steps away was never safe care. Step 6. Silence is respected. Best case help does not require updates. No surprise filming. No content first behavior. No, just letting people know. If care is real, it survives silence. In fact, silence becomes proof that the help is about the family, not the audience. The result of best case. The result is not viral. It's stability. The family becomes less visible. Access becomes narrower. The system relaxes slightly because risk is controlled. And the helper, whoever that is protected from suspicion because everything is documented and bounded. This is the only path where help remains help. Timeline 2. The worst case outcome. Why it happens so easily. Worst case is not evil. Worst case is confusion. And confusion is far more dangerous than malice. Worst case begins the moment structure is skipped, just this once. Step 1. Authority is assumed, not granted. Someone shows up. The public assumes they're in charge. Messages start flowing. Talk to him. He knows what's going on. Send money to him. Authority forms socially, not legally. This is how accidental gatekeepers are born. Step 2. Boundaries blur. Help becomes open-ended. One errand becomes many. One favor becomes responsibility. One decision becomes default authority. No one plans this. It just happens. And because the helper is familiar, no one stops it early. Step 3. Money creeps in. Worst case always intersects with money. Not greed. Not theft. Logistics. Someone needs something. A bill is due. A donor offers help. Suddenly money passes through hands. No receipts. No logs. No separation. At this point, intent no longer matters. Exposure exists. Step 4. The audience returns. Visibility creeps back in. People want updates. People want proof. People want reassurance. Content reappears, even subtly. The family becomes a stage again. And now the system notices. Step 5. Opportunists appear. Where structure is weak, others move in. Impersonators. Unauthorized fundraisers. People claiming inside access. Not because anyone invited them. Because fame attracts chaos. Step 6. Agencies clamp down. This is the part people misread as punishment. Protective services tighten access. Confidentiality increases. Contact becomes restricted, not because the helper is bad, because the environment has become unsafe. This matters beyond Mark Laita. It applies to any would-be helper. Anyone who believes presence equals permission. Anyone who believes history equals authority. Anyone who believes silence equals consent. Those beliefs no longer survive contact with the system. Where this leaves us, if someone could return under strict safeguards, the real question becomes, why hasn't it happened already? Is it fear? Or is it recognition that 2026 has a different reality? Because sometimes not returning is not abandonment. It's respect for boundaries that didn't exist before. By 2026, the question is no longer should someone return. The question is under what conditions would any return be allowed at all? Because once vulnerability, publicity, and alleged exploitation collide, the system stops negotiating in feelings and starts operating on standards. Those standards are not optional. They're not personal, and they're not designed to reward good intentions. They exist to prevent harm, even accidental harm. So if Mark Laita or anyone else were to attempt a return as a caregiver, here is the actual bar that must be cleared in 2026. Not vibes, not history, a checklist. One verified point of authorization. There must be one legally recognized authority who can approve or deny access. Not a group, not a general understanding, not implied permission. If no one can clearly answer who is allowed to say yes or no, the situation is already unsafe. This protects the family from confusion and protects helpers from acting without authority. 2. Oversight is mandatory, not optional. When vulnerability is established, oversight is not an insult. Is the system saying, no one carries this alone? Oversight means check-ins, documentation, external review, clear reporting lines, not because helpers are distrusted, but because concentrated power is dangerous, even when unintentional. 3. Zero money handling. In 2026, money is the fastest way to turn help into harm. No private transfers, no cash, no I'll take care of it. Every dollar must move through verified, visible channels with records. This rule exists because money creates leverage and leverage creates control. 4. No exclusive access. No one person becomes the gateway. When one helper controls contact, information, or resources, the system responds by locking everything down. Distributed access protects autonomy. Exclusive access invites intervention. 5. Written boundaries. Not assumed boundaries. Not common sense. Written ones. What help is being provided? What is off limits? What triggers a stop? Boundaries are not distrust. They are clarity. 6. No content-first behavior. Care cannot depend on visibility. No surprise filming. No pressure for reactions. No updates framed as proof of care. If help is real, it does not require an audience. 7. Documentation protects everyone. Logs, receipts, check-ins, not for performance, for protection. In a famous case, documentation is the difference between clarity and chaos. The final truth. These safeguards are not barriers to kindness. They're the conditions that make kindness safe. They protect the Whittakers from becoming a stage again. They protect helpers from suspicion. They protect the system from repeating the same failures. And they answer the hardest question of all. If returning requires structure, silence, limits, and accountability, is a return still about helping? Or was it about access? That's the question 2026 forces everyone to answer. What is the one rule you would require before any return? Oversight, no money, or no exclusive access. One word. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.